Welcome to No Occasion to Shout. Robin just read me a quote, and I'll listen to it again and tell us about the quoter.
Yeah, sure. So I should just say, as way of kind of context for this, that when I was, I want to say 18, I came across the notion of a commonplace book. And a commonplace book was a notebook that men, especially in Edwardian times, would carry around to jot down notable phrases, quotes, lines of poetry often, things that had some kind of intellectual or spiritual value to them. And I mean, I guess now, if anybody was collecting things like that, it would go in the iPhone. But back then they had this thing called a commonplace book. And I thought that was a great idea. And so back then, as a kind of a late teenager, I began keeping a commonplace book, which of course now means a file on my laptop. And it really is one of the most important files that I have. Certainly the top 5 most important files, because not only is it a record of some of the greatest wisdom or some of the ideas that have caused me to think the most throughout my adult life. But it's also, in a way, kind of a record of my own personal development, right? Because I can
Really?
go to the beginning of this. And it's
What age did you start this at? You said 18?
I think it was 18 or 19. I think it was something like that, yeah.
I think I'm going to start that now. Might be a little, it's never too late for that.
Right. You're still young. What are you talking about?
Yeah, if I turn 30, I'm like, I'll be like, I should have done that when I was 23. So yeah, I'll start doing that.
Yeah, no, I recommend it because now, I'm a writer and so on. I find myself drawing on it a lot, and I love my quotes. I love good quotes. I use them in my own work, and I use them, because often they're beautiful and often they say something more effectively than I would have said it. But just because, they break an article often, they will give color. They'll give a different flavor to an article. And so I'm often opening my Commonplace Book file, which is just a Word document, 205-page long Word document, and always growing. And so the quote I kind of randomly picked, I opened this file and just kind of randomly went to a point on the file, was the following. The person who is anxious is a person who is resisting the flip-floppability of things. The person who is anxious is a person who is resisting the flip-floppability of things. Now, in my life, especially when I was at your age, Austin, I had big issues with anxiety. And it's something I have to manage. And so that quote certainly spoke to me, and I recognized the truth of it when I heard it. And it was said by a guy called Alan Watts. And I've got to guess that anybody who's found us and is enjoying the kind of stuff we're talking about, there's a good chance they know who Alan Watts is. Have you heard of Alan Watts, Austin?
I'm going to need context. I might have heard of him, but I don't remember the name.
Sure.
If I did.
So Alan Watts, like me, was a British American, a British-born American, and he was kind of prolific mostly in the 60s into the 70s. He called himself a spiritual entertainer or a philosophical entertainer, but that was quite self-deprecating. His claim to fame is that he really introduced the philosophy of the East, Tao Te Ching, I Ching, in a substantial way to the West. Starting, as I say, I'm going to say around 1960, but he went on for a long time. And if you Google him, put him in a YouTube search, there was hundreds of hours of seminars, talks, lectures, presentations that he gave that were recorded, and they're just wonderful. Apart from the fact that this guy has a deep understanding of his subject matter and a real gift with communicating it, deep ideas, in very simple ways. he does it with this most friendly and easy to listen to voice. So I would put his lectures on to fall asleep too. And almost like a lullaby, like a philosophical lullaby. And
so let's go deeper into what he meant by that, because you would know. But my question is, for a lot of things, I agree with that quote. For me, anxiety has been something that I used to give up on and not fight. And it's recently begun to be something that I do fight. And when I am in my worst of anxieties and I go, let's say, to school, if I don't listen to my anxious minds or anxiety, I'd start developing physical symptoms. And it is almost uncanny that there's this certain road that every time I've gone on it for the last 3 times, I've experienced just random stomach pain. And that may be Pavlovian effect. And I think a lot of this has to do with Pavlov too. I think a lot of it has to do with forming good habits in order to get rid of anxiety. But the flip-flop effect, I wouldn't say is necessarily 100% true, unless we're talking about flip-flopping in terms of developing patterns or habits. But if you have a anxious habit, I feel like it's very hard because I get in severe physical pain.
What do you mean an anxious habit?
By anxious habit, I mean purposely avoiding every anxious situation.
Oh, you mean avoiding anxiety? Habits formed to avoid
Yes.
avoid the experience of anxiety. Okay, yeah, okay. Right, yeah. So Alan Watts talked a lot about he drew the distinction between the Western notion of white must win. Right? We're in a game of white versus black. White must win. The good must win. Right? The outcome is better if we kill black and white wins. Whereas what he talks about with a more Taoist conception is that there is black and there is white, and the games will be played. And that the correct bastardizing this horrendously, but the correct understanding of reality is that necessarily sometimes white will win and sometimes black will win. And all
50%.
the game is going on, that is reality. And so you can either resist what's so, or you can accept what's so, because whichever you do, it's what's so, right? So, accepting it is really the only game in town. And so you can push against the war if you want, and all you will happen is you'll get tired and there'll still be a war. So how about you don't push? And as I'm saying this, so I think, the idea of resisting the flip-flop ability of things, I think there's 2 fundamental ideas in there that he's saying relates to the nature of anxiety. The first one being the resistance, the inability to accept what you can't control, right? Making your happiness dependent on something outside of yourself, always a hide into nothing. And certainly the Eastern religions, the Eastern traditions, multiple of them, that Alan Watts introduced to the West in the 60s in a rather deep way, involve learning to stop resisting what is so, right? Taoism is to swim with the river, right? It's not to.
And it's a flip-flop effect.
No, so that's the resistance.
Okay.
The flip-flop is his recognition, I think, that what goes up always goes down, and there is no down without
Okay.
up. That you can't only have ups. That not only is that not the way the world's constructed, logically it can't be that way. So
Okay. So it's learning about managing the downs and managing the ups.
well,
So
I think fundamentally it's accepting it, but maybe with respect. I mean, managing in the sense you mean it is obviously important, and I used the word already, didn't I, on this show with respect to anxiety.
well, I mean, I can't just come home drunk and start beating up my siblings and be like, it's the way of life. I have my downs.
No, and that's not. Yeah, that's not what he's. That's not. It's not a moral excuse. He's making a rather deep point. It's. I mean, it's certainly metaphysical, if not ontological. And he actually does use this example. That it is impossible to have a thing without a non-thing. You can't have a crest of a wave without a trough. Now he gives the example of so the meaning in speech or the beauty in music. We think that the foreground is the thing. So we think that the notes are the bit of music that is music. But of course it isn't. The notes are no more important than the things that aren't playing when they're not playing, than the gaps between the notes, right? The writing on the paper, is the pattern the black, the ink, or is it the white around the ink? What's the thing? And to say one thing is the thing and the other thing is not the thing is to misunderstand that the thing depends on the non-thing.
Yes, but the thing has tangibility and the non-thing does not. Tangibility is one aspect in which they differ.
Well, I think it depends on. No, I think in general that's not the case. There is, for example, the stars in the night sky. There's certainly more. You could say there's more matter in the stars than in the space-time in which they sit. But there is no logical way that one can exist without the other.
Yes.
And the space-time is not empty. Similarly, the paper is not no thing. You write on paper, the paper is not no thing.
So you're saying because of biases of cognitive biases, optical biases, that we tend to associate the thing as more important than not the thing. And
yes. And
logically, that doesn't make sense. And logically, we should think about what it means for the opposite of something to exist. We should think about darkness as thoughtfully as we think about light.
Yes. And he talks a lot about, poles, right? The thing, like, you take a magnet. A magnet has a North Pole and a South Pole. Now, the North Pole cannot exist without a South Pole. And if you try and cut the magnet in half to keep the North Pole and get rid of the South Pole, then what you do is you have half a magnet and a new South Pole, right, at the other end, at the end of the new magnet that was in the middle of the old magnet, right, before you cut it in half. So this pairing is something that he talks about a lot. And anxiety is needing white to win, right? It's not realizing. I mean, look, I'm thinking also of Peterson, right? Peterson talks about the set of, are you playing to win the game? Or are you playing to win the set of games, or at least be invited back to the meta game, or
Yes.
right, that involves the playing of multiple games?
Yes, right now in life, I'm not on the main quest. I have a bunch of side quests. I haven't been invited back to the main quest, if that's the metaphor for life.
Well, you see, now Peterson is very much, he's reminding us of that to provide some kind of psychological insight and benefit to people who listen to it.
Yeah.
Alan Watts is talking about metaphysics. Right?
Okay, yes.
So you can, he's not telling anybody how to live a better life. He's just saying that there are things that are so, there are things that, and the understanding what so accurately and living according to it, which is a very Taoist idea, will generally leave you happier than not doing that. He talks, I mean, and he really, he does wonderful things with these notions of polarity and dichotomy. He has this beautiful, I'm sure I've got this quote in my Commonplace book too. I'm not looking at it, so I'll do it from memory. He says, there are gooey people and there are prickly people. There are the people who say everything's goo, and there are people who say everything's prickles. But actually, of course, the world is prickly goo and gooey prickles. And that's a very Alan Watts kind of way of speaking. And, you know, because obviously you can't have a gooey prickle and you can't have prickly goo, but actually that is exactly what he's trying to tell us we do have, you know, all there is.
So what about deep-rooted fears of things? Deeply rooted fears of like spiders or heights or...
Well, Alan Watts isn't talking about that kind of thing, and a phobia isn't an anxiety. I would say...
What's the difference between a phobia and an anxiety?
Well, I had a phobia for most of my life, and I believe it's gone now.
Was it Americans?
A phobia against Americans. Yeah, and I'm self-loathing now, ever since I had my citizenship ceremony. No, it was actually, I know exactly what it was, and I know the moment it began. I had a phobia of crustaceans, of crabs especially. And I remember when I was a kid, I was at the beach with my dad, and we were rock pooling. Have you ever done that? You know, the little the balls going out in the shallow, the rocks going out in the shallows, you know, out to sea. And then when the tide goes out, pools of water are, you know, kept among the rocks, and there are little creatures in there. And as kids, you know, it's a lot of fun. You have a little net, you go in and you see what you can find, beautiful shell, a little fish, whatever, right? So I was doing this with my dad. And the rocks were very slippery, yeah, all of the, you know, the seaweed and stuff, and I was walking on it, so it was very slippery. And a crab, this little crab, came out of one of the rock pools and ran across my feet, one of my feet, and I was shocked. And
so childhood memory associated with crabs developed into a phobia. How did you get rid of the phobia? That's what I want to hear you talk about. How did you manage it?
Well, I'll tell you the bit of it that caused me the phobia, which took me 5 seconds. I slipped because of the crab. I moved really fast. I lifted my foot, and I went back, straight back, and I just missed the jagged rock with my head. I was pretty, like, you know, 7 years old, something like that. So I knew I nearly killed myself just by, you know, an inch or two. And that was what caused it. And then I remember a couple of years later, my mother thinking this was all very silly and chasing me around the kitchen with a shell of a crab that was obviously dead because they'd been making a crab dinner out of it. And I was terrified. I mean, it was like a switch went in my head, completely irrational. And that was a phobia. And there was no mental processing going on. There was no actual cognition. Whereas my experience of anxiety, which has been much more comprehensive, it's a much more serious thing in my life.
Did you get over the phobia?
Yeah, I did, and I think I did it by increasing my exposure very slightly and very slowly. So as I got older, I would go swimming in the sea, and I would, it sounds crazy, take the risk in the shallow part of the sea, and I would take the risk of actually just standing on the sand. So the water would be up to here, and I would just stand on the sand under the water, knowing that a crab could go over my foot again, right?
I know someone who is terrified of, or has a phobia of driving. And they drive all the time. But they're driven. But it's not like... No.
Driven. Okay, yeah.
So the exposure doesn't work there.
Well, the exposure in that case would be to actually get behind a wheel in a very safe environment. That would be you know, so first of all, you would give them a huge track with no other cars on it, go really slowly with somebody there to take the wheel if necessary. That would be the equivalent. Because it sounds like
slow exposure. Okay, so very gradual exposure. Okay.
Well, in my case, and I'm not saying that's the prescription of phobias, or all things that people think of phobias, because I understand from reading Deutsch, you know, his work on neuroplasticity, that it ain't that simple. It doesn't work that way. But a very crude, basic phobia like the one I had, with a specific cause, that worked for me. To your point about fear. Now, I can't remember who said this either, but almost all unhappiness originates in mistaking the partial for the whole. Now, that describes a lot of what's caused me to be anxious at certain points in my life. And it describes it in as much as, for me, my experience of anxiety, it is completely a physical thing, but obviously there is something almost obsessively, I would be thinking about something. I would be analyzing something to death. And Alan Watts makes the point, by the way, that analysis is it's a very violent idea, right? It's got the word lysis, which is to split. And you know, analysis is a very violent kind of thing to do. And I think if you've got a disposition to anxiety, and certainly if you're somebody like me, ENTP, right, where you'll cut something up as much as you can from as many different perspectives, and put it back together in as many ways. I mean, it can be. I certainly had the experience up until my early 30s of having this. I experienced myself as having a set of mental tools that I didn't have the emotional wherewithal to handle using. And yeah, the most important part of my adult life has been getting those things in balance, bringing up my emotional, I don't know, spiritual, if you like that word, strength, sophistication, or whatever, so that my mind, my ability to analyze, would cease to be my master, and it would be my servant. I certainly experienced my bouts of anxiety all through my life when I've had them as basically being controlled by my thoughts rather than the other way around. And that isn't to say I was an obsessive. I mean, I don't think I've ever been diagnosed with anything like OCD, but at the worst anxieties I've had and the most prolonged one, where I've been most debilitated, certainly my thinking has been obsessive. And you know, so it's doing a lot of this violence to myself in notion. Yeah, mental violence. Yeah, it certainly felt that way to me. It was yeah. And then so I said about,
I would agree. Selective attention has helped me. Just the concept of selective attention, because I always tell myself, with a trillion different brains and a trillion different opinions and a trillion different uses of words, each of those trillion brains could look at a situation and think about it in a completely different way. And each of those different ways could have varying and multiple different ethical approaches or political approaches or serious things with consequence. So if I'm thinking about something in a negative way, I tend to try to think of it in a positive way instead. But a lot of it honestly has to do with brain chemistry and the chemicals in my brain, because I've done a lot of experience. I have a lot of experiences with boosting serotonin, boosting dopamine, taking different drugs to see the neurophysiological side effects. And my point of view is definitely a lot different when I have serotonin, for example, which I basically have no serotonin in my brain. I think I just have severe depression, but I take serotonin to help that.
Okay.
And it's almost not a decision. It's just how you're feeling. But to your point about the flip-flop also, how you're feeling can also be, you can also do things to influence how you're feeling, including just smiling makes you feel better. And then that can produce the chemicals, which then ultimately produce your perspective.
Absolutely. And I know, and it took me a long time to internalize this, to experience it. I probably knew it intellectually before I actually internalized it. But that it's, you know, whilst we think that our thoughts determine our conclusions, which determine how we feel, that it isn't that way at all. Your feelings determine what you'll think about things. And that's really hard for someone who's basically a bit of an intellectual purist, you know, a scientist by training. You know, I kind of grew up not wanting that to be the case because I can't understand that world. Like, oh, you mean it's not all rational? But it isn't. It isn't. And it's a hugely important thing to learn. And that idea about what you do there, you know, to try and take another one of the trillion perspectives. That is, I think, exactly what that realization that unhappiness or anxiety arises from mistaking the partial for the whole is trying indeed to invite you and me to do. It's like this, all I can see is this, and it's all terrifying. If only I can do that, then I go, oh, okay, this is only one piece of the reality. And I discovered, because I think people who suffer maybe from these kind of things have to find their management mechanisms, right? Mental management mechanisms. And I know for me, what sometimes has worked is to pick up a book about the most abstract or fundamental or general or philosophical ideas. So I put my head on something so, like, as far as possible removed from whatever I think is the problem affecting me right now. In other words, I make myself and my experience feel small on a universal scale by attending to the universe. But that's worked for me at times.
Sublime aesthetics.
Yeah.
That's what that would be.
Yeah, actually, yeah. Indeed.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting way to look at things, from just dive into philosophy, sublimely looking at things, abstractly. I've never done that. The way I tend to manage my thoughts is to do some type of physical activity that changes things.
Yeah.
So going out and doing something, or having sugar, or having amphetamine, or
okay.
Mentally, I've never really made myself feel better, I don't think. If I'm upset, I can't mentally psych myself out of it. I have to ignore all the thoughts in my head and just go and do something random, like jumping into cold water.
Yeah, being able to have an intense sensation that takes you out of your head. There's another quote. This one might be Ram Dass, but it might not be. Might be Wayne Dyer. I don't know. I'd have to consult my Commonplace Book. But to come to your, you have to get out of your head to come to your senses, or by coming to your senses, and get out of your mind. And I know someone who has OCD, and that's one of her ways of very much. She will try and put herself in give herself an experience of intense sensation. I don't think that I get that. It doesn't work for me as well, but one thing that I do often do is I just burn off the mental energy physically. So
yes, that's basically what I do.
yeah,
So
yeah.
process things physically.
Yeah, I mean, and for me, that will often mean running. Like, I'll just run. I'll
Mhm.
just go till I'm just like exhausted. You know, and get some endorphin, something going, right?
Yeah.
And let my mind play it out. Because I catch myself doing the resisting. I do that thing that Alan Watts says not to, right? I'll be in something, and then I just like, you know what? Okay, it's going to rage. I'm just going to let it rage, and I'm going to walk around my neighborhood for 4 hours at 3 in the morning until it's done. And sometimes, that's, it's a pretty crude approach, but it
Mm.
worked for me at times too.
All right, so that's the episode, guys. If you suffer from anxiety, the things you need to do are get out of your head and do something that changes the perspective or the chemical balance in your brain. Like going out and just working out. That changes the chemicals in your brain. So you have a new perspective, then you can get out of your head. Use the senses to get out of your head. And be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Anything you want to add to that, Robin?
Yeah, no, that's great. I love how we never have a clue what we're going to talk about when we start. Like literally,
Yeah.
10 seconds before we started the show, we didn't know what we were going to do. So again, as we get more subscribers, I think I said this on a recent show, we're soliciting for ideas, folks, right? If there's something a direction we go in, something we've touched on that you'd like us to talk more about, let us know. Let us know. All right?
Yep.